Nadia Osei had a rule about Mondays. She did not complain about them. She did not groan when the alarm went off at 6. She did not stand in the shower for 12 minutes, telling herself she deserved a break. She got up, she made her tea, she ironed her blouse, and she walked out of her flat in East London with the same expression she wore to job interviews. Calm, prepared, slightly ahead of whatever was coming. This Monday was no different, except that it was the Monday before the worst week of her professional life, and she did not know that yet. She was 29 years old. She had worked at Meridian Global Partners for 3 years. She had been promoted twice, missed a third promotion that went to a man named Paul who wore the same cologne every day, and somehow never got questioned about his figures, and she had said nothing about that either, because saying something would not have changed the outcome and would have cost her something she could not afford to spend. She was not bitter. She had decided, early, that bitterness was a tax she refused to pay. She walked through the glass doors of the Meridian building at 8:42. She said good morning to the security guard, whose name was Leonard, and who always looked slightly surprised that she knew it. She took the lift to the 7th floor. She sat at her desk. She opened her laptop. She opened her email. There was one from Derek. Derek was her manager. His full name was Derek Calloway, and he had the particular quality of a man who had been middle management for so long that middle management had become his entire personality. He meant well. That was the most generous thing Nadia had ever thought about him, and she had thought it often, because she believed in being generous where she could afford to be. The email said, "Come see me when you're in. Exciting news." She read it twice, not because it was complicated, but because she had learned to read things twice when they came from Derek. There was usually a layer underneath that the first reading didn't catch. She made her tea. She took it to his office. She knocked. "Nadia." "Brilliant. Come in. Come in." He gestured at the chair across from his desk with the enthusiasm of a man who had rehearsed this. "Close the door." She closed the door. She sat. He leaned forward. He had his hands clasped on the desk, which meant he had thought about what he was going to say and was now hoping she would not ask too many questions about it. "We have a new position for you," he said. She waited. "Senior Liaison. International Acquisitions." She waited. "Reporting to Harlow Voss." The name sat in the room like something that had been dropped from a height. Derek was watching her face. He did this whenever he said something he knew had a bad layer. He watched to see how much she already knew. She knew everything. Every professional in this building knew the name Harlow Voss. He was the head of international acquisitions, which meant he was responsible for the largest deals the company made, which meant he had the kind of authority that made people nervous even in buildings he was not currently standing in. He was brilliant. He was results. He had, in the past 8 months, had 4 assistants and liaisons cycle through his office like people passing through a revolving door that had been set to the wrong speed. There had been a settlement. There had been exit packages. There had been conversations that happened in HR suites with the blinds pulled. No one said the word difficult. They said demanding. They said exacting. They said he has very high standards. He had very high standards the way a fire had very high temperatures. "What happened to the last one?" Nadia asked. Derek's hands shifted on the desk. Priya decided to pursue other opportunities. Priya had been the 4th. Nadia had shared a lift with her once in September, and Priya had had the look of someone who had been running uphill for a long time without being told how far the top was. "Right," Nadia said. "We think you're the perfect fit," Derek said. He was using his sincere voice now, which was slightly lower and slower than his regular voice. "You have the experience. You have the professionalism. You have the resilience," she said. He paused. Yes, exactly. She looked at him for a moment. He was not quite meeting her eyes. He was looking at a point just slightly to the left of her face, which was what Derek did when he was delivering something he knew was not good news, but had decided to frame as good news. "When does it start?" she asked. "Monday," he said. Then he seemed to remember it was already Monday. "Next Monday, you'll have this week to transition your current projects." She nodded once. She stood. She picked up her tea. "Nadia," he said, "this is a real opportunity. The exposure alone." "I know," she said. She walked back to her desk. She sat down. She looked at her screen. Right then, she spent the rest of the week doing two things at the same time. On the surface, she transitioned her projects, briefed her colleagues, wrote handover notes that were clean and detailed because she did not believe in leaving things messy, even when she was the one being moved on from them. Underneath that, she read everything there was to read about Harlow Voss. Not gossip, not the kitchen whispers about what he'd said to Priya, or what had happened in the Geneva meeting. Those were the emotional residue of his behavior, and emotional residue was not useful to her. She wanted the structural version, the pattern. She found his published interviews, 3 of them, in industry journals. He spoke in precise, complete sentences. He did not use filler words. He did not say things like, "probably," or "we'll see what happens." He said things like, "the data suggests, and the timeline is non-negotiable, and if you can't defend a number, don't bring it to the table." She read the company's international acquisitions reports from the past 4 years. She found his fingerprints on every major deal, not just in the decisions made, but in the questions asked. There were footnotes in some of the internal documents, comments logged in the company's shared system. His comments were short, they were sharp, and they were, almost without exception, correct. He was not wrong. That was the thing she kept coming back to. The 4 people before her had not been fired because Harlow Voss was irrational. They had been burned because he was relentless, because he moved at a speed most people found unsustainable, and because he had no patience for the gap between what he expected and what people delivered. He saw that gap as a failure of preparation. He treated it accordingly. She could work with that. What she could not work with was the other thing she found. Buried in an exit interview that had not been properly sealed in the company's archiving system, a comment from the second liaison, a man named Thomas Park, who had written, "He's not trying to be cruel, he just doesn't notice when he is." She read that 3 times. That was the most important thing she had learned all week. She arrived on the following Monday at 8:30, 7 minutes early for the 8:37 lift she usually took, because she wanted to be at her new desk before anyone else arrived in the acquisitions department. She wanted the first geography of the space, where things were, who sat where, how the light came in, which desks had personal items on them, and which ones were purely functional. The acquisitions floor was on the 11th floor. It was larger than the 7th. The carpet was a darker gray, which either meant it was a more senior department or that it had simply been renovated in a different year. The desks were arranged in clusters rather than rows. There was a glass-walled conference room in the far corner with a view of the Thames that on a clear day must have been extraordinary. Harlow Voss's office was not glass-walled. It was a proper room with a door, which was closed, and a panel of frosted glass beside the door, which meant you could see a shape inside but not a face. A light was already on behind the glass. 8:30 in the morning. He was already there. She found her desk, which was positioned close enough to his office to be immediately useful, but not so close that it felt like monitoring. She sat. She set up her laptop. She found the shared drives she'd been given access to. and spent 20 minutes reading through the active project files so that when he walked out of that office and asked her something, she would already know the answer. He walked out at 9:17. He was tall, which she had expected from photographs. He was perhaps 50, though he could have been 46 or 54. He was the kind of man whose age lived in his eyes more than his face. He wore a dark jacket and no tie, which surprised her, because she had imagined a tie. He was looking at his phone as he came out of the office. He stopped when he saw her. "You're the new one," he said. "Nadia Osei," she said. She did not stand up. Standing up would have been performing a deference she did not feel. "Senior liaison." He looked at her for a moment. Not the way Derek looked at people, sliding his gaze just past them. He looked at her directly, which was either refreshing or unnerving depending on your disposition, and she had decided before she arrived that it would be refreshing. "The Accra proposal," he said. "Current status." This was a test. She knew it before he finished the sentence. He was checking whether she'd read the files. "Preliminary due diligence is complete," she said. "The site assessments came back Wednesday. There are 2 outstanding items. The regulatory sign-off from the Ghanaian Infrastructure Board, which has a stated timeline of 6 to 8 weeks, and a discrepancy in the land valuation reports between the independent surveyor and the company's internal estimate. The gap is approximately $400,000. He looked at her. "The regulatory timeline is optimistic," she said. "The actual historical average for that board is closer to 11 weeks. I'd build in 14. A pause. Short. The length of a breath. "The valuation discrepancy," he said. "Source of the gap? I haven't determined that yet. I've been here for 42 minutes. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. Nowhere near a smile. But the very slight easing of attention she hadn't noticed was there until it moved. "Find out by Thursday," he said. He went back into his office. She looked at her screen. Right then, she found out by Wednesday. She sent him a memo. Not an email. A properly formatted memo. 3 paragraphs. Numbered points. A clear conclusion. At 4:53 in the afternoon. The memo explained that the valuation gap came from a difference in methodology between the 2 surveyors. The independent one had used a comparative market analysis based on regional sales data, while the internal estimate had been based on projected development value, which was standard practice for acquisitions of this type, but which she noted tended to skew optimistic by a margin that often needed managing in final negotiations. She included 3 similar historical cases from the company's own records where the same gap had appeared and how it had been resolved. At 5:12, a reply appeared in her inbox. It said, "Satisfactory." That was it. 1 word. She printed it and put it in her desk drawer. Not as a trophy, just as a data point. A baseline to measure against. The next 3 weeks were the hardest professional weeks of her life, and she had once rebuilt an entire market analysis report from scratch in 48 hours after a server crash, so she was not setting a low bar. Harlow Voss worked at a pace that suggested he had made a private agreement with time to simply move faster than it did for other people. He was in the office before 8. He was often still there after 6. He reviewed documents overnight and returned them with comments that were specific enough to be useful and sharp enough to leave a mark. He did not soften his language. He did not add phrases like "great effort" or "almost there." He said what was wrong and what he expected to be different. She watched 2 other members of the acquisitions team struggle with this in the first week. She watched one of them, a young analyst named James, spend an entire morning redoing a comparative analysis that Harlow had returned with 4 comments, each one a precise surgical identification of where James's logic had failed. James looked, by lunchtime, like a man who had been asked to carry something heavier than his arms were built for. She did not tell James it would get better, because she did not know if it would get better for James. That would depend entirely on whether James wanted to learn to carry the weight or wanted someone to lighten it. What she did was this. She quietly asked James if he wanted a second pair of eyes on his next draft before it went up. James said yes. She spent 40 minutes on his draft that evening. She did not rewrite it. She asked him questions. What's your evidence for this figure? What does this conclusion rest on? If someone pushed back on this point, what would you say? Until James himself found the weak spots and fixed them. James's next submission came back with 2 comments instead of 4. Both of them were fixable. She said nothing about it to anyone. Harlow Voss, she was certain, did not notice. He had not asked her to help James. He had not asked her to help anyone. Her role was not to manage the team's emotional landscape. Her role was to be the most useful person in his professional life, and so she was the most useful person in his professional life, and anything else she did on the edges of that was her own business. In her 4th week, she made her first real mistake. She had prepared briefing materials for a call with a partner firm in Dubai. The call was at 2. She had the materials ready at 1:30. At 1:58, she discovered that one of the figures in the briefing, a current valuation multiple that she had sourced from a market report, was out of date. The report had a revised version issued 2 days earlier that she had not seen because it had been filed in a shared folder she had not been monitoring closely enough. The figure was wrong by 11%. She had 3 minutes. She went to his office door. She knocked once and opened it without waiting, which she had not done before, and which she did only because she had 3 minutes and waiting for an invitation would cost her 60 seconds she did not have. "The briefing has an error," she said. "The industrial valuation multiple. I have the correct figure. I need 90 seconds. He was already on his headset. The call was starting. He held up a hand. He said into his headset, "Give me 2 minutes, Kareem. I'll come back to you." He looked at her. She gave him the correct figure. She gave him the source. She told him the reason for the discrepancy and that she had not caught the updated report in time. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Which folder?" She told him. "Add it to your monitoring list," he said. Then he turned back to his call. Not, "How did you miss this?" Not, "This cannot happen again." Not, "I'm disappointed." Just, "Add it to your monitoring list." She went back to her desk. She added the folder to her monitoring list. She sat quietly for a moment, with something she could not immediately name. It took her a while to understand what it was. He had not punished her for the mistake. He had corrected the conditions that caused it. He had treated the error as a systems problem, not a character problem. She had expected, based on everything she had read and heard, a display of sharp displeasure. She had been prepared for it. She had her responses ready, calm, accountable, not defensive, not crumbling. She had the whole script. He had not used the script. He had gone sideways of it entirely. She did not know what to do with that, so she filed it and kept working. The Tuesday in March arrived in the way that unremarkable Tuesdays arrive, which is to say, it did not announce itself as significant. There were no signals. The morning was cloudy. She had brought soup in a thermos because it was colder than the forecast had said. She had 3 project deadlines that week and had mapped out her time accordingly. She stayed late that evening to finish a draft she needed to be clean before Wednesday morning. The acquisitions floor emptied gradually after 6, people peeling away desk by desk, until by 7:15 it was mostly quiet. The cleaning crew came through at 7:30. She thanked them by name. They seemed surprised each time. She went to pick up her notebook from the conference room where she had been working on the draft, because the conference room had a better screen and she had needed the wall space for her reference documents. The door was open. She pushed it. Harlow Voss was sitting at the conference table. His laptop was open, but he was not looking at it. He was sitting very still, in the way that people sit when they are not resting, but when all of their energy has been directed inward, and the outside world has become temporarily irrelevant. She noticed his phone on the table. The screen was dark. He had been on a call recently. She could tell by the way the phone was positioned, angled toward him rather than laid flat. She understood, without needing to analyze it very long, that she had walked into something private. Most people would have said, "Sorry, didn't see you, I'll come back." That was the socially correct move. It preserved everyone's dignity and exited the situation cleanly. She looked at him for 1 second. Then she walked in and sat down. Not across the table. Beside him. 2 chairs over, so it was not crowding him, but close enough that the choice was unmistakable. She set her notebook on the table. She did not open it. She did not say, "Are you all right?" She did not say, "Do you want to talk?" She did not say anything. The clock on the far wall made its small sound. The city outside the window made its distant, constant noise. A bus. A siren. Far away. Rain beginning on the glass. He sat with whatever he was sitting with. She sat with him. She was not performing patience. She was simply present, in the particular way that required nothing from either of them. After 11 minutes, she knew, later, because she had glanced at the clock when she sat down, and again when he spoke. He said, quietly, "My father." She did not ask what. She did not ask, "Is he all right?" or "What happened?" She understood, with the precision of someone who had received that kind of phone call herself, what those 2 words contained. She nodded once. Small. Enough. They sat for another few minutes. She did not try to fill the silence. The silence was doing something. Filling it would have ruined it. Then she stood. She picked up her notebook. She walked out. She left a pen behind, lying on the table. Not her good pen. An ordinary pen, the kind she kept several of. But she left it deliberately, so that there was a small concrete reason for the evening to have a postscript, a return, a brief exchange, a door that did not close all the way. The pen was back on her desk the next morning by the time she arrived. Under it was a post-it note. The handwriting was precise, small, slightly left-leaning. It said, "Thank you." She put the post-it note in her desk drawer. Same drawer as the email that had said, "Satisfactory." She did not look at them together and draw conclusions. She just put the note there and went back to her work. What happened after that was not a transformation. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own private accounting of events, because she had no patience for the kind of story where a person's fundamental nature is altered by a single moment. People were not reformed by kindness the way bread was reformed by heat. It was slower than that, more complicated, and the results were less uniform. What happened was something more like a calibration. Harlow Voss did not become gentle. He did not stop being exacting, or demanding, or direct to the point where other people felt the roughness of his directness in their own chests. He still sent documents back with comments that could strip paint. He still had zero patience for unclear thinking. He still asked questions in meetings that could make very capable people suddenly feel much less capable. But something shifted, in some operational layer that was not visible to most people in the building. She noticed it first in a small thing. A project manager named Claire had made an error in the quarterly projection summary. Not a large error, not one that would affect the final numbers, but a real one. a misclassification in the category columns that would show up in the audit. Claire had flagged it herself, in the same meeting where Harlow found it, a split second before he could point to it. He looked at Claire. Claire looked back, clearly waiting for the verdict. "Good catch," he said. 2 words. He moved on. He did not return to it. He did not make Claire sit in the discomfort of having made the error any longer than the error required. Claire blinked, recovered, moved on with the meeting. Nadia noted it, filed it, kept working. The second thing was in how he began to use her name. Not more often. He was not a man who used names decoratively, the way some managers did, dropping them into sentences as a way of performing warmth. But when he did use her name, something in the construction of the sentence around it had changed. There was a weight to it. Not affection. She would not use that word. Not yet. Maybe not ever in that context. But respect. Functioning the way respect is supposed to function, as a thing you can actually feel rather than just observe.
He began to ask her opinion. This was not in her job description. Her job was to liaise, to manage the flow of information, to prepare materials, to manage logistics.
Her job was not to have opinions about acquisition strategy. But he began, in the last week of April, to ask things at the end of briefings. Not formal questions, not questions that would be recorded anywhere, but quiet asides on his way back into his office. What did you think of the Singapore numbers? The risk profile on the Lagos site. Does it read well to you, or does the language smooth over something? If you were in the room with Kareem's team, what would you watch for? She answered honestly every time. She did not dress her answers up, or hedge them into safety. She said what she actually thought, and what she actually thought was usually grounded in something specific. A figure she had noticed, a pattern from a comparable deal, a question the documents raised that the documents did not answer. He listened. He did not always agree, but he listened in the way that meant he was taking it in rather than waiting for her to finish so he could continue with what he already planned to do. In the office, among the people who spent their days watching the weather patterns of Harlow Voss's disposition, this was noted. The interpretations varied, as interpretations always do when the evidence is limited. There were people who decided she had charmed him, which was the most common theory, and which contained the implicit assumption that the charming was deliberate strategy, which made it somehow suspect. There were people who decided she had compromised herself in some way, which said more about those people than it said about her. There were people who thought she was simply surviving him by being very good at her job, which was the closest to accurate but still missed something. There was almost nobody who thought she treated him like a person who was capable of being reached, and it turned out he was. That version was apparently too simple to be convincing. Nadia heard all of it, because offices are not quiet, and people are not as subtle as they believe themselves to be. She heard the theories in fragments, a sentence cut off when she turned a corner, a look exchanged across a desk that assumed she was not watching, a comment that arrived to her second hand through a well-meaning colleague who prefaced it with, "I heard something and thought you should know." She filed it all. She did not respond to any of it. She had built her professional life on the principle that the most powerful response to noise was output, not argument, not defense, work. You answered misrepresentation with results, and results accumulated in a way that gossip eventually could not outlast. She just kept doing the work. June arrived with warmer weather and 3 simultaneous deals that pushed the acquisitions team to the edge of its capacity. There was a hotel portfolio in Southeast Asia, a logistics infrastructure project in northern Nigeria, and a preliminary assessment of a renewable energy company in Portugal that had arrived unexpectedly because a competitor had made a move, and Meridian needed to decide in 2 weeks whether to counter or step back. Those 2 weeks were, by some significant margin, the most concentrated period of professional effort in Nadia's career to that point. She was in by 7:30 every morning. She was rarely home before 8. She ate at her desk more often than not. She ran on tea, and the particular kind of focus that arrives when there is simply too much to do for anxiety to find a foothold. You are too busy moving to have time to be afraid. Harlow was in by 7. He had always been in by 7. She wondered, sometimes, in the brief moments between tasks, whether he had a life outside this building that was rich or thin, or somewhere in between. She did not ask. It was not her business, and she was not sure he would have answered in any case. On the Thursday of the second week, at 6 in the evening, they were both still in the office, working through the Portugal assessment, when the system went down. Not the internet. The company's internal document management system, which held every version of every file they had been working from, went down for 45 minutes due to a server issue. 45 minutes in which they could not access anything. He stood up from his desk, walked to the window, looked at the Thames. She closed her laptop. "There are 3 things about the Portugal assessment that are bothering me," she said. "Since we have time." He turned from the window, sat down, not at his desk, but in the chair across from her workstation, which was close enough for a direct conversation. "Tell me," he said. She told him. The 3 things were specific: a discrepancy between the company's stated energy output figures and the independent verification data that was large enough to require explanation, a question about the ownership structure that the documents referenced but did not fully resolve, and a concern about the regulatory environment in Portugal for foreign acquisitions in the energy sector that she thought the preliminary assessment had treated as more settled than it actually was. He listened without interrupting. She had noticed, across the months, that he had this quality, the ability to listen to a complete thought before responding. It was rarer than it should have been. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The output discrepancy," he said. "What's your read on it? Methodology difference or something more deliberate?" "I think it's methodology difference," she said. "The numbers are consistent across their own internal reporting, which means if they're lying, they're doing it with unusual discipline. More likely they're using a calculation method that produces higher figures. Common enough in that sector. But you're not certain." "No, that's why it bothers me." He nodded. "The ownership structure. What are you missing?" "One of the holding entities has a registered address in Luxembourg that I can't resolve back to a named beneficial owner in the public records. It may be standard privacy structure. It may be something worth understanding better. Worth pausing the assessment for?" She thought about it. Not performing thought, actually thinking, which took a few seconds longer. "No," she said. "Worth a direct question to their legal team. Ask them to confirm the beneficial owner chain on that holding entity within the preliminary documentation window. If they hedge, that's information. If they answer cleanly, we move forward." He looked at her. "That's what I would have done," he said. She registered this, because it was the first time he had said that to her. The most direct form of professional respect he had offered, and he had offered it quietly, without apparent awareness of its significance. The way people sometimes say the most important things. The system came back up. They went back to work. She left at 9:15. He was still there. She did not say good night, because she had learned that he found procedural social exchanges at the end of long days mildly irritating, and she respected that more than she needed the exchange. She was on the bus home when something arrived in her chest that she did not immediately recognize. It took her the length of 3 bus stops to name it. It was satisfaction. The particular, specific kind that arrived not from being praised, but from being met, from thinking hard things with someone who could think them back. She had not expected this. She had expected to survive Harlow Voss. She had expected to be competent, to be useful, to be the person who lasted where the others had not lasted. She had prepared herself for difficulty, for friction, for the grinding work of operating in close proximity to someone whose way of being in the world was sharp and demanding and relentless. She had not prepared herself for the possibility that she might find it genuinely interesting. The October board meeting was a quarterly review, which meant it was routine, except that it wasn't routine, because the 3 projects that summer had produced results significant enough to make the acquisitions department one of the most discussed in the building. The hotel portfolio had closed at better than projected terms. The Nigeria infrastructure deal was in its final stages, with strong early indicators. The Portugal company had been assessed. The beneficial ownership question had been answered cleanly when asked directly, and Meridian had made a counteroffer that was currently being evaluated. These results did not arrive from nowhere. They arrived from specific decisions, specific work, specific people. The board knew this. The board were not foolish people, even when it was convenient for the rest of the company to treat them as figures in a distant room rather than people with clear eyes. Nadia sat along the back row of the board meeting, which was where the support staff sat, not at the main table. She was not there to present, she was there to manage the documentation flow, to have the reference materials at hand if they were needed, to be useful in the background. The acquisitions presentation was Harlow's. He presented with the same precision he applied to everything, clear and specific and unadorned. No stories, no warmth applied artificially to soften hard numbers. Just the numbers and the reasoning behind them. Gerald Achebe asked his question 20 minutes in. Gerald Achebe was the board member that other board members deferred to, not because he was the oldest or the most senior, but because when he spoke, it was always worth stopping to listen. He had said perhaps 30 words in the entire meeting before this moment. He had been looking at the projection documents with the concentrated attention of a man who was reading not just what was there, but what was underneath what was there. He looked up. The Portugal analysis, he said. The 3 concerns that redirected the due diligence approach. Whose thinking was that? A silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Board meeting silences have a density to them. They carry more weight per second than other silences. Harlow Voss looked at the table for one of those seconds. Then he looked along the row at the back wall until his eyes found Nadia's. Then he looked at Gerald. Hers, he said. He did not point. He did not elaborate. He simply attributed, cleanly and without apparent difficulty, in front of every person in that room whose opinion mattered most in this building. Gerald Achebe turned and looked at the back row. Nadia met his eyes. You sat on the attribution, Gerald said to her. Not an accusation, an observation. He was cataloging facts. The project needed a champion with the board's confidence, she said. It had that. We can discuss attribution now that it's past the threshold. Gerald Achebe was quiet for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that felt like evaluation rather than hesitation. Practical, he said. Then the meeting continued. The agenda moved forward. Papers were turned. She sat in her back row chair and felt the room differently than she had felt it 4 minutes earlier. She could not describe exactly what had changed in the room. The temperature was the same, the lighting was the same, the people were the same, but something in the weight of her presence in it had shifted. She had not asked for the credit. She had not pursued the recognition. She had done the work, let the work carry the project to where it needed to go, and then, when the question came from the right person at the right moment, the truth had simply been told. Harlow Voss had told it. She had not expected that either. She had thought, in the back of her mind, that she would need to navigate that moment herself when it arrived. Find a way to step forward without stepping over anyone. Claim credit without performing the claiming. She had been prepared for the possibility that the attribution would stay ambiguous, subsumed into the general success of the department, and she had decided she could live with that, because the work itself was more important than the record of it. He had not made her navigate it. He had just told the truth. She did not mark this as a debt owed. She did not adjust her behavior toward him based on it. She simply updated her understanding of what he was capable of, and she filed that in the same drawer, metaphorically speaking, as the other things she had learned since March. After the meeting, in the corridor, Gerald Achebe paused beside her. He did this briefly, without breaking his stride entirely, which was the boardroom equivalent of a private conversation. "The ownership chain question on the Portugal holding entity," he said. "Good instinct." "The answer was in the pattern from 2 earlier deals," she said. "Once you know what the structure usually looks like when it's legitimate, the variations are easier to spot." He looked at her for a moment, a look she could not read entirely, except to know it was positive. "Yes," he said. Then he walked on. She went back to her desk. She made her tea. She answered the 12 emails that had arrived during the board meeting. She did not call anyone to tell them what had happened. She did not send a message. She sat with it quietly for a few minutes, the way you sit with something good, not to celebrate it exactly, but to let it settle into a real place, rather than something you'd only half believed while it was happening. Then she went back to work. November brought rain and the early dark of winter in London, which Nadia had never quite made peace with despite having lived in London her entire adult life. The city in November was beautiful, in a gray way that she appreciated without enjoying. She kept extra tea at the office. She took the longer route from the station sometimes, through the market street that had the good bread smell in the mornings, because small pleasures were worth arranging. The acquisitions department had, over the course of that autumn, developed a new internal climate. This was hard to document and would have been hard to present to anyone as evidence of anything specific because it was made of small things. The number of questions James asked before sending his work up had increased, and the quality of the drafts had improved correspondingly. Claire had taken on a component of the Southeast Asia portfolio review that was at the edge of her experience, which 6 months earlier she might not have attempted. 2 other analysts had begun, gradually, to be less braced when Harlow's feedback arrived. Not because his feedback had become gentler, but because they had begun to understand what it was for. Nadia had not orchestrated this. She was not a manager. She had not run workshops or initiated conversations about teen culture, or done any of the things that would have been legible to the organization as change management. She had simply been consistently herself, in a place where most people had previously either collapsed or departed, and it turned out that consistency had a gravity to it. People moved toward what was stable when the surrounding environment was demanding. Harlow Voss noticed. She knew he noticed because of the particular way he did not comment on it, which was the way he registered things he was still processing. He commented on what he had already resolved his thinking about. Things that were still being processed arrived as silence with a tension in it, a slight pause, a look that rested a half-second longer than necessary. She let him process. In December, something happened that she had not anticipated and that she thought about for a long time afterward. She was working late, again, on a closing document for the Nigeria deal, which had reached its final agreement phase and required a great deal of precise language in a short time frame. It was close to 8 in the evening. The floor was empty except for the 2 of them, which had become an occasional circumstance and which they both treated as simply what happened when the work required it. He came out of his office and stood at the edge of the work area. He was holding his jacket, which meant he was about to leave. He looked at what she was doing. The sub-clause on the infrastructure maintenance obligations, he said. Third paragraph. She looked at the third paragraph. Too broad, she said. It leaves the definition of routine maintenance to the acquiring party's discretion, which is favorable to us in the short term, but creates exposure if they challenge it in year 3. Tighten it, he said. I know. I'm tightening it. She was already adjusting the language as she said it. A pause. He was still standing there. She glanced up. He had a look on his face that she had not seen before, which was notable because she had become fairly fluent in his expressions over the months, and a new one was an event worth registering. It was not quite thoughtfulness, and not quite discomfort. It was something she would have described, if she had been pressed, as a man arriving at the edge of something he did not usually cross. You'll be in the Singapore meeting, he said. January. She looked at him. Not as a liaison, he said. At the table. She understood exactly what this meant. At the table meant decision-making capacity. At the table meant she would be in the room not as the person managing the flow of information, but as one of the people making the decisions that the information was flowing toward. This was, in the particular language of their organization, significant. All right, she said. He nodded. He put on his jacket. Good work on the Nigeria close, he said. Then he left. She sat in the empty office for a moment. She looked at her document. She tightened the subclause on the infrastructure maintenance obligations until it was precise enough that no party could challenge it on definition grounds. She did this carefully and well, because it needed to be done carefully and well, and also because doing the thing in front of you to the highest standard was the only form of response to significant news that she fully trusted. Then she packed up her laptop, turned off her desk lamp, and walked out. On the way home, on the bus, she thought about the 4 people who had sat at the desk before her. Thomas Park and his exit interview, and his note about a man who did not notice when he was being cruel. Priya, with her look in the lift. The others, whose names she knew from HR files, and whose shapes she knew from the stories that moved through office corridors like low-level weather. She did not think of herself as having done something they could not do. That framing was not useful, and was probably not accurate either. She had done something specific. She had seen Harlow Voss clearly, without the distorting lens of fear or the softening lens of pity, and she had decided that what was there was worth working with. She had held her own position consistently enough that he had eventually been able to find it and lean on it. She had not fixed him. She had not healed him. She had not reformed him through the power of her decency or her resilience or any of the words that would eventually get attached to this story when other people told it. She had just not left, and she had been very good at her job, which, in her accounting, was always the more important of the two. The Singapore meeting in January went well. She presented 3 components of the assessment. She defended one of them, the risk premium she had applied to the political environment component, against a challenge from a senior partner at the counterpart firm. She defended it clearly and without heat, grounded in 2 specific cases that she had prepared in advance because she had anticipated the challenge. And she was right, and the premium stayed in. On the flight back, Harlow looked at her across the aisle. "The political risk component," he said. "How did you know they'd push back?" "Because they pushed back on the same item in the Kuala Lumpur deal in 2019, she said. "It's in the archived deal records. Same firm, different personnel, same argument." He looked at her for a moment. "You read 2019 deal records," he said. I read all the archived deal records, she said. I did it in October. I thought it was useful to understand the historical patterns. He turned back to the window. Yes, he said. It was. The plane continued its course. London was 7 hours away. She put her headphones in and read the document she had been saving for the flight, which was a market analysis she had requested on East African infrastructure investment trends. Because she had a thought about a gap in their portfolio coverage, and she wanted to understand the terrain before she brought it to him. She would bring it to him in February. He would read it in 20 minutes and then ask 5 questions, all of which she had answers to, and one of which she did not have an answer to and said so, which he acknowledged with a nod that meant he respected the honesty more than he needed the answer immediately. He would say, "Develop this further." She would develop it further. That was how it went. By spring, she had been in the role for just over a year. She was not measuring the time. She was not the kind of person who marked professional anniversaries, but the year arrived in her awareness anyway, in the way that time has of announcing itself even when you are not watching for it. The acquisitions department was, by most measures, the strongest it had been in 4 years. The deals closed in the previous 12 months had performed at an average of 7% above internal projections. Gerald Achebe had mentioned this at the March board meeting, and he had mentioned it in a way that attributed it specifically to the department and specifically to the work coming out of the department in this period, which everyone in the room understood to mean specific people. Derek had sent her a congratulatory email. She had replied, "Thank you, Derek. Nothing else," because nothing else was required. She had a conversation with Gerald Achebe's assistant about a potential advisory committee role. She had a conversation with HR about her compensation, which had a conversation with her that she concluded politely and successfully. She had a conversation with herself, alone, walking along the river on a Sunday morning when the city was still half asleep, about what she wanted the next 5 years to look like. The Sunday morning on the river was the most important of the 3 conversations, though she would not have framed it that way to anyone else. She had come into this role because a building full of people had decided she was expendable enough to send to the difficult room. She had stayed because she chose to stay. Those 2 things were not the same, and keeping the difference clear in her own mind was important to her. She had not survived Harlow Voss. She had worked beside him, which was a different thing entirely, and the distinction mattered. In May, a profile of the acquisitions department appeared in an industry publication. It was a moderate-length piece about Meridian's performance in international markets. Harlow was quoted. Several deals were described. The writer had done their research adequately, if not particularly deeply. Near the end of the piece, there was a paragraph about the team's analytical approach. The writer had spoken to several sources within the company. The paragraph attributed the risk assessment methodology to the senior liaison who had, according to one source, changed the internal dynamic of how the department thinks about information. She read this paragraph on her phone, on the bus, on a Tuesday morning. She put her phone in her bag. She looked out the window at the city going by. The market street, the early commuters, the gray sky beginning to thin at the edges where the light was trying to come through. Right then, she got off at her stop. She walked through the glass doors. She said good morning to Leonard. She took the lift to the 11th floor. She sat at her desk. She made her tea. She opened her laptop. She had work to do. She did not think, in those first moments of the morning, about the profile or the attribution or the way the past year had assembled itself into something recognizable as a story. She thought about the East African infrastructure analysis and the call she had scheduled with a contact in Nairobi for that afternoon, and the question she most needed answered before the call, which was about the land tenure framework in a specific northern region and whether it had been updated since the previous assessment. She pulled up the relevant regulatory database. She started reading. Harlow came in at 7. He walked past her desk. He did not mention the article. She did not mention the article. This was not because they were avoiding it. It was because it was not, in the practical accounting of the day, the most important thing in front of either of them. At 9:45, he came to the door of his office and said, "The Nairobi call. Walk me through what you're looking for." She walked him through it. 4 minutes. He asked 2 questions. She answered them both. He nodded. He went back into his office. She went back to her reading. It was, by every external measure, an ordinary morning. The phones rang. The emails arrived. The coffee machine in the corner made its noise. The city outside the window carried on its complicated business. Inside it, in the particular quiet of a floor full of people doing hard things with their full attention, something continued that had been continuing for a while now. Not a story with a beginning and a middle and a clear end, but the ongoing practice of 2 people who had found, through difficulty and time and a great deal of precise, unglamorous work, a way of being professionally useful to each other that neither of them had fully expected and both of them had, in their different ways, decided to keep. She finished her reading. She picked up her tea. It had gone slightly cold while she was working, which she preferred, actually. She had always found very hot tea harder to drink quickly, and she was often in situations that required her to drink it quickly. She made a note in the margin of the regulatory document. She moved on to the next one. Outside, the sky had done what London skies do in late spring, which is produce, without warning or apology, a patch of genuine gold light that fell through the window at an angle that made the Thames, for about 20 minutes around 10 in the morning on certain days, look like something out of a painting. She noticed it briefly. She appreciated it in the quick, clean way that she appreciated most things. Fully, without performing the appreciation, without lingering longer than the moment needed. Then she went back to her work. That was the thing about Nadia Osei. That was always the thing. She noticed what was worth noticing. She registered what was real. She did not make more of things than they were, and she did not make less of them either. She just kept doing the work, and the work, over time, kept being what it had always been. The most honest answer she knew to every question the world had ever asked her. She was good at it. She was very good at it. And in a world that often rewarded performance over substance, she had found, in the most unlikely room, beside the most unlikely person, the rarest of professional conditions, a place where the substance was enough. That was sufficient for her. It was, in fact, exactly enough.